Hi everyone, a big welcome back to the G2Z online series. Thank you for joining us today. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. My name's Nell Thompson. I'm the coordinator of the National Getting to Zero, or as we call it, the G2Z program. I'll be hosting the webinar for you today. Getting to Zero was developed by the Animal Welfare League of Queensland, and they continue to support it to this day. G2Z offers its consulting, support and educational services at no charge to local governments and not-for-profits across Australia. Our focus continues to be on companion animal welfare and management issues such as strategy, legislation, operations, programs, and community engagement, working towards reducing intake to pounds and shelters and keeping pets in their homes. We invite people to take a look at our website at g2z.org.au, sign up for our regular e-news, connect with us via social media, and get in touch with us to see if we can help or just to have a chat about the issues that are facing your community or organisation. So to today's session. Once I hand over to our presenter, there'll be around 50 minutes of presentation time and around 10 minutes of question time once the presentation's concluded. The recording of this webinar will be accessible via our website to everyone to watch at any time. That usually takes a day or two for me to get that up there. And we're going to ask that everyone mutes themselves during the presentation unless our presenter indicates otherwise. If you've got questions, you can start putting them in the Q&A section and we'll get through as many as we can at the end of the session. If you've got very quick questions that relate to your understanding of the content, put your hand up using the button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to those during the presentation. As always, please excuse any working from home background noises that may filter through. We've all got dogs and all sorts of things. I've got house renovations happening here in the background. But I'm very happy to introduce Ness Jones today. Ness Jones is a certified separation anxiety pro behaviour consultant and specialises exclusively in this field. Ness is also a canine behaviour practitioner, has a diploma in canine behaviour from the International School for Canine Psychology and Behaviour, is certified in applied canine ethology from the Ethology Institute, and is a certified professional dog trainer. She's also a canine myofunctional therapist, small animal nutritionist, and holds a diploma as a small animal naturopath. Ness believes these qualifications enables her to take a more holistic approach when dealing with separation-related behaviours. We do like having overachievers on our webinars, so thank you, Ness. And she's also the co-host of a podcast called Tales from the Doghouse, Separation Anxiety Explained. So check that out wherever you get your podcasts. So over to you, Ness.
Thank you so much, Nell, and thank you so much to G2Z, especially for all the work you do with dogs and cats, and yeah, around Australia. It's such an important field, and thank you for doing that, and thank you for having me. So yes, we'll get started. We're going to be talking about dog separation anxiety or separation anxiety dogs. And specifically for the best humans in the world, for those who adopt, not shop, and how to avoid separation anxiety. But we're going to obviously focus on rescue dogs, shelter dogs, and, you know, sort of drill down into them a little bit more specifically. Some of the stuff you hear in this seminar will be... I'm sorry, somebody knocked at my door. I'll just carry on and pretend you can't hear them. Yeah, so we will be talking about separation anxiety in dogs, but more specifically for shelter dogs. I'm so sorry, I hope it's not too loud for you guys. So what to expect? We're going to an introduction to separation anxiety, understanding the causes of separation anxiety. What are the signs of separation anxiety? Some preventative measures. Chase, Chase, come on, Papa. thank you. Understanding thresholds and gradual exposure, therapy and desensitization, and what I call the alone method. If you do have any questions, as Nell said, there will be a Q&A at the end, so don't be shy. You can write in the Q&A chat box, which we can address at the end, or we may ask you to unmute so I can ask you questions as we go along. Nell's already touched on all this, so I'm not going to dwell on it. You've just heard my 3 Malinois barking because somebody knocked at the door. I knew there was a delivery coming today and they said it was going to be before 12. So there you go. I live on the Gold Coast in Australia. I do have 3 Malinois, as I said, but my heart dogs are Rottweilers. And I specialise, I am a dog trainer. I am also a small animal naturopath, as Nell mentioned, but my speciality now is separation anxiety or separation related behaviours specifically. And these are some of my qualifications. We won't go into all of them. But what I do like about these qualifications is it does enable me to take a more rounded, a more holistic approach to dealing with this topic. And as she said, I am also the co-host of Tales from the Doghouse, Separation Anxiety Explained podcast. And yes, and years ago, I did have a dog who struggled with home alone time. And we'll talk about that because at the time she was a young dog. She was a teenage dog, and I know that's something that can often be an issue with shelter dogs. Is they often, my experience anyway, is that most dogs are surrendered to shelters when they're in their teens, because that's when we see all those problematic behaviours. I'd be interested to know your take on that. Maybe you could just put something quickly in the chat and say that is also your experience, that a lot of dogs in shelters, or when they are initially surrendered, are in their teens. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about what separation anxiety is and what it's not. So it is defined as an disorder in which dogs exhibit extreme fear and emotional distress when they are alone. And obviously we see, it's aversive for them to be by themselves, and we see them behave in ways that we don't obviously want. And it is generally an emotional and an involuntary response. Studies vary, so we don't get too caught up in the 20 to 40%. Some studies say up to 60%, some say, 30 to 50. So, it varies. We don't really know, but maybe around 20 to 40%. And it will depend on things like, for example, COVID, work from home situations. So that obviously going to fluctuate depending. It is believed to affect slightly more male dogs than female dogs. And as I said, the research varies, and including what breeds are predisposed to it, that varies as well. But some of the behaviors that we see, some of the unwanted behaviors we see are urinating and defecating. Now, this is despite being house trained. So dogs that, sorry, something's just popped up on my screen. Dogs that are normally house trained, they don't go in the house, but when they're left by themselves or in any situation, obviously in shelters as well, they can't cope and they'll defecate and urinate. I know it's slightly different for shelter dogs because they often don't have a choice anyway, if they need to go. Barking, howling, crying, whining, I'm sure you guys see a lot of that. For me, those particular traits or behaviors are probably the most common for dogs. Trembling, salivating, panting heavily. It's quite obvious. They get those wide whale eyes. We're going to go through in a bit, and some of this may not be relevant to some of the audience. Some of the signs, the subtle signs, or some of the signs and the context of those signs in terms of their body language and their behavior. To have like I said, some of you will know this back to front, some of you it might be a new thing, so it is important to understand what they are and also the context. So chewing, digging and destroying things, often it could be toys, soft bedding, so maybe a dog in a kennel environment might eat up its bed or something. But we'll talk a bit more about that. And escaping. I'm hoping that dogs don't escape from shelters. I don't know. I did actually, by the way, volunteer at the AWL Queensland Coomba a few years ago. So I have seen what it's like in that type of environment, but not all environments, obviously. Some more would be pacing. I'm sure you see a lot of that, the dogs pacing backwards and forwards. Shelters, as we know, are highly stressful environments. So that can may not be part of separation anxiety, but it could just be stress. And obviously anxious before the person walks out of sight. They get anxious before that happens. The difficulty with shelter dogs, though. So, as I said before, teenage dogs, their numbers are probably higher in shelters. Happy for someone to disabuse me of that idea, but I imagine teenage dogs. That's the time that we see all the stuff, all the behaviours that they do, and that's when they get surrendered. Not all, obviously, but teenage dogs. Also, so that dog I showed you, the dog I had years ago, that she actually dug holes in my plasterboard when I went off and left her by herself. She was that stressed. But she was also a teenage dog and I wasn't meeting her needs, and her behavior was based in frustration or FOMO, which is fear of missing out. So teenage dogs might show behaviors, and this is why we use the blanket term separation related behaviors as opposed to separation anxiety, because any dog exhibiting a frustration / FOMO behaviors may not have anxiety or separation anxiety. They may actually have frustration FOMO. So the behavior is still unwanted, but it's based in something else, not necessarily anxiety. Unfortunately, it can tip over into anxiety if it's not addressed. The other thing is any training that we do with a shelter dog in terms of, it can't cope with being by itself. Unfortunately, dogs don't generalize well. So what that means is anything they learn in a shelter or even in a foster environment, when they go to their new home, we need to do some more training around that. And that is why if a person came to me and they had their dog and they were saying, well, I'm going to send it to a board and train to fix this issue, is probably not going to be of any use to the dog, because maybe they do get some success in that environment at the board and train, but when they come home, because they can't generalize that behavior, the training needs to be redone and reestablished in the new home or in the home. So same applies for shelters. So you could do training with the dog in the shelter, but it doesn't necessarily mean the dog's going to cope when they go to their new home. Obviously, as you know, shelter environments are very stressful for dogs. And so sometimes we don't see the behavior we don't see the true dog. So that could be that the dog shuts down and just can't cope. And, it's like they don't, we don't see any behaviors because the dog is shut down. Or we get the other side of the coin where they are overstimulated. And that's when we see those really high, behaviors where the dog is, barking, crying, pacing, but just off its head, really. So you've got the two types of dogs when you might see different behaviors, and neither of them might be the true dog. Often shelter dogs have been through several homes as well, so for whatever reason, and that can make it harder for them. They might struggle more in the shelter environment. Of course, we've got poor genetics, poor upbringing, not enough socialization. And then we have dogs that often, and we don't know why, but it could be genetics or upbringing. They have, they're just scared of the world anyway. So they don't have just anxiety around being by themselves. They might actually have generalized anxiety. So anything to do with their world is scary and traumatic for them. And also of course, with shelter dogs, sometimes I'm sure you know the history of the dog, sometimes I'm sure you don't. We have to ask the question, what trauma have they been through prior to arriving in the shelter that might impact them? For example, so this isn't a shelter dog situation, but I think it's a really good example of how trauma can impact a dog. Some clients of mine, dogs were fine to be left by themselves, didn't matter what time of day, they were absolutely fine. And then one time the couple went out for dinner and the house was burgled. It was obviously very traumatic for the dogs. And after that, they couldn't cope with being by themselves in the evening because it coincided with the time that the burglary happened. So they were still fine to be left by during the day, but not in the evening. So that sort of trauma can impact the dog. And, you know, unless you know what the dog has been through prior to arriving at the shelter, it's guesswork, I guess. So it's just something we need to keep in the back of our minds. So some causes of separation anxiety. So I've mentioned genetics. Unfortunately, some people are breeding dogs and cats that haven't got great genetics. And they, you know, the dogs, maybe the parents might have anxiety and then they're breeding them and their dog puppies come out and they've already got anxiety, and it just is this horrible chain reaction. Predisposition. So yes, some dogs may be slightly more prone to it. However, it could just come down to the popularity of that breed in that country or wherever you are in the place. Oodles, oodle type dogs. I mean, we're seeing so many oodle types, labradoodles, cavoodles, cockapoos, etc., etc., etc. They, because there's so many of that breed, or you know, that type of dog, it might skew the numbers, and we could say, oh, well, oodle type dogs are more predisposed, but it's just they are a popular breed in Australia. So it could be more to do with that. So we have to be, you know, cognizant of that and not leap to the conclusion. Like dachshunds are quite popular too. So lots of dachshunds might have separation anxiety, or is it just because they're a popular breed? So as I mentioned, past experiences and trauma can impact them for sure. You know, if you know what the dog's gone through in the past, it can make a big difference to whether they can cope. Confidence is a big thing for dogs. So a dog that is not confident is obviously going to struggle more being by itself. And that comes down to also the next point, which is lack of socialization and exposure to different environments and people. So when you've got a puppy, you know, they say you've got that window up to 16 weeks where the dog should have proper socialization to build confidence. And that has to be done properly, obviously. And unfortunately, if they don't get that, it can really impact them. I'll talk a little bit more about that in another slide coming up, but so we'll circle back around to that. Changes in the household or routine. So that obviously is a big thing for shelter dogs because they've been taken out of their home environment, theoretically, depending on the situation, obviously. And now they're in a shelter. So it can completely throw them out and confuse them. And it can really have a huge impact on their ability to be by themselves. And big life changes like moving home, obviously, and moving into a shelter, I would definitely call that a big life change, whatever the background is. So all these things can impact the dog. Also uncertainty about what comes next. So dogs are creatures of routine. They like certainty. And when they're uncertain, when they're not confident about what is going on, what comes next, that can really impact them. Just some things that might, so coming back to the COVID thing and the work from home, but COVID, I know when COVID started, a lot of the shelters were cleared out. You couldn't get a puppy or a dog for love nor money, including the rescue organisations and the breeders. Unfortunately, when people started trickling back to work and to school, etc., a lot of those dogs ended up back in the rescues. Some of them were puppies that maybe they got from a rescue, from a breeder. They've lived for 2 years at home, 24/7 with their people, and then they're dumped in a shelter because people have gone back to work or what have you. That dog has never, ever learned to be by itself. It's never been taught about having a safe home alone time. And so, yeah, it's going to struggle. It makes sense. Ill health and pain can impact, can cause, you know, separation anxiety. So if a dog is in pain, it makes it harder for it to be by itself. Cognitive decline in seniors, that's a big one. You know, maybe they're losing their eyesight, their hearing, or maybe their brain function that can impact them. Young dogs and teenagers, I've already talked about that. So those dogs might show signs of distress. We just have to drill down into what is causing it. Is it because they're just young? Is it because they've never learned to be by themselves? Is it because they actually have generalized anxiety themselves? And of course, rescues. So then we need to assess the severity of separation anxiety. So in this photo, you can see this dog has torn up whatever that is on the floor. It looks like a rag or something. So, you know, we'll talk about this when we come to the signs and the symptoms of separation anxiety, but basically, okay, so you've got a dog that's torn up something. So then we say, well, how old is the dog? What outlets has it got in its life? Is it bored? Is it frustrated? Or is it so anxious it doesn't know what to do with itself, so it tears up whatever's in front of it? So we really, if we can, possibly understand what is happening for that dog and why it's doing it, that can help us. But first of all, you need an assessment. So if a dog is struggling, then a vet visit is usually a good start. So we can rule out pain, we can rule out ill health, we can rule out, you know, senior dogs. With dogs' ability to cope with being home alone, things like allergies, arthritis, gastro issues, all those sort of things, pain, obviously, can make it harder for them to be by themselves. So that vet visit is really important, because if it is pain related, then we can obviously help give them something to help them with that, and maybe they won't struggle so much. Okay, so this is important. And as I said earlier, some of you, it will be, I already know all this stuff. For others, it might be a new. But we need to look at some of the less obvious signs that the dog is feeling distress, but then we also have to look at the context of what it is. So a dog lip licking, and for me, that is a dog that might dart its tongue out. So that sort of, you probably can't see, but you know, the context is important. So while some people might say, well, the dog's lipped its lips, so therefore it's stressed, the context might be, well, did it just eat or drink? Did it, you know, is it concentrating on something? Is it anxious, or is it processing? So on its own, I'm not too worried about lip licking. I often look at a dog and say, well, they're processing something, they're thinking about something, they're processing something. So as an isolated standalone behavior, I'm not too worried about that. It's if I'm seeing a whole range of other signs in conjunction with that, then I'm worried that the dog is struggling. Yawning, same thing, on its own, isolation, it's fine. But it has been called a stress yawn. It's sometimes also called a calming signal. And if you guys ever want to learn more about calming signals for dogs, that it's a brilliant little book. It's only very tiny, and it's how dogs communicate with each other when they're but they're showing their signs of they're either trying to calm themselves down or they're feeling a little bit stressed. So again, the context is important. Is the dog sleepy? Did it just wake up? Is it trying to calm itself down, or is it stressed? You often find it's you'll see a dog do it when maybe, say, you're trying to get it out of the kennel and they're expecting to come out of the kennel, but you're maybe asking them to do a sit or something, and they might do a great big yawn. It's not because they're sleepy, they're probably excited, but they're just releasing that sort of stress, or, you know, they're trying to calm themselves down. And scratching and licking themselves. Obviously, we have to rule out itchiness or allergies, but it can be a displacement behavior. So they're unsure about something, so they might start scratching or licking, or, you know, they could be feeling uncomfortable about a situation, so they might do that. And that is the same with sniffing. So sniffing, dogs will often sniff. Actually see that a lot more in cats, I think, the scratching and the licking. But with sniffing, you'll see a dog sniff when they're maybe feeling unsure about something. The context again is Is there something interesting on the ground? Are they smelling another dog? Or are they trying to tell the time? Because maybe not so much in a shelter environment, but dogs can smell the odor in the air and try to determine how long they've been by themselves, the human odor. Playing. So I always say that so you can't really have a dog that's playing and being stressed in the same world theoretically, but is the dog actually having fun? Is it playing with its toy because it's having fun, or is it downloading stress? And I'm sure you see a lot of this in the kennel and shelter environment. I know I did when I was volunteering. A dog that was playing, but as a way to try to get rid of some of that stress. So how do we tell that? That's kind of more knowing the dog as an individual and saying, well, this is what the dog looks like when it's playing, when it's nice and relaxed and chilled out, as opposed to a different type of play where there might be more intensity because the dog's trying to download stress. Digging. So I guess digging into bedding in a shelter environment. Is it doing that because it's trying to download its stress, or is it just bored? And we know in shelters, there's not that many outlets for dogs. I know everybody's going to have a different situation in terms of where you guys work. But so it just depends how much they can do in that environment. Panting, obviously, is it hot? Is it stressed? So panting, when a dog is stressed when they start panting, as opposed to being hot, because you'll see the other behaviours. You'll see the wide eyes. You'll probably see lots of drool, and you'll see other behaviours that will tell you that the dog is stressed as opposed to hot. Shake off. So that looks like when a dog gets out of the water, they do the shake off. That can be, dogs also do it when they wake up. And sometimes, it is just literally, I've just got up, I'm doing shake off. Other times it's kind of like us shrugging our shoulders. So we're trying to shrug off the stress. Stretching, again, are they trying to release energy, stress or tension? Or do they just wake up and they're just having a nice big stress? But I don't know if you guys have ever done it. I know I do it. I will stretch like that, try to get rid of tension if I'm somewhere I don't want to be. For example, outside the dentist's waiting room, I'll stretch because I don't want to go in. And the paw lift is that sort of, the paw lift is really interesting because it can mean so many different things. So it can mean the dog is uncomfortable and unsure. It could mean that it's curious about something. You see pointers like that. They're like focus, razor sharp focus, and they paw lift because they're focused on it. My dog, she paw lift different reasons just very recently. So she'd hurt her toe. So she was obviously in pain. So her paw was up. But then I had a treat. Once that was better, I had a treat and she was lifting up her paw because she wanted it. So they talk with their bodies. Some other signs, drooling. My boy dog, he's noise phobic. So when there's a storm, you'll see that very wide eyes. Whale eye was where you can see more of the whites of the eye. Drool. Oh, it's like a river. And of course, panting very heavily. Obviously anxious before the person leaves, the significant person, or before they're left alone, they can become anxious because they know what's coming next. Tuck tail, obviously. Flattened ears. That depends on the dog. I've got pointy-eared ears. I've got dogs with pointy ears. Really easy to see what the ears are doing. With dogs like this one in the photo, a bit harder to tell what the dog is thinking with its ears, but generally they might flatten and they might pull back a bit more. So you get that sort of they're not sitting normally, they'll pull back a little bit more. You'll see a crease here in the brow, maybe some tightness around the mouth as well. So there's so many different things. hiding. Obviously, dogs will hide when they're stressed, or some dogs will, others will freeze and become like a statue. So dogs that are just frozen stiff like that, very big sign of stress. So we need to look at, when we're observing a dog, we look at the whole body language. We're looking at the tail, the back. Is the back roached? Is it stiff? Is the dog frozen? Is the dog tight? Or is it nice and loose? What are the ears doing? What are the eyes doing? What's the mouth doing? Also, so we need to look at the whole picture. And then, as I said, you might see one sign in isolation, may not be a worry, even if it is based in stress. I mean, obviously make sure you understand the context, but if it is based in stress, if it's just one little sign, it's not too much of a cause for concern. It's when we see the whole gamut, when we start seeing all these other signs all bundling up, and we've got a dog that's gone from, oh, I'm slightly uncomfortable, to I'm getting a little bit more uncomfortable, to I'm just holding it together, to the full-blown panic. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier. So with COVID lockdowns, that was a big problem, because dogs missed out on so much, and many of those dogs are now in shelters. So Sargeson, in 2014, he said that dogs that aren't adequately socialized between the ages of 5 months and 10 months, they miss out on the confidence that they need to cope with the world. So they're more likely to develop separation related behaviors, but they're also just not confident dogs, because they missed out on this big window. And that is the case with a lot of COVID dogs. What that socialization looks like, of course, is it's a little bit of confusion around that, I think, from most dog guardians, because they maybe think it's just taking the dog to the park to run around with other dogs. It's not really that. It's more a case of exposing the dog in a really, really safe way to build their confidence to things. So it could be kids, it could be umbrellas, it could be prams, skateboards, motorbikes, trucks, but taking them to a football game, but not letting them be overwhelmed by it, taking it to Bunnings, but not letting them be overwhelmed. So helping them feel safe to build that confidence, and that flows through lovely into, separation related behaviors, home alone time, but also in their ability to cope with the world in general. And unfortunately, there's a lot of dogs running around at the moment that missed out on that particular window. Sargeson said 5 months to 10 months. I would say ideally a long time before that. In an ideal world, we get if it's a dog that's been bred properly, that the mum's being looked after, she's in a low stress environment, the puppies are whelped in a low stress environment, the breeder gives them all their needs and builds their confidence up and exposes them to things, but in a safe way. And then obviously they go to their new homes, and that flows through right up to the age of 10 months. And then you get, a dog that's much better able to cope with the world in general. Of course, bearing in mind that they do need good genetics to start off with. And unfortunately, there's some unscrupulous people out there breeding dogs that have poor genetics. So yeah, I've touched on what socialization looks like. It's not taking them to the dog park and letting them run around with other dogs. That is valuable, but I'm sure you guys know, down the dog park, you do get bullies down there, you get people on their phones not paying attention, you get a young dog down there, and it's not healthy socialization. So and of course, like I've mentioned, this COVID really hit dogs hard. Work from home, a lot of my clients now work from home. They have continued working from home since the whole lockdowns, and so they have to be really cautious about that, and giving the dog the chance to be by themselves, but in a safe way. So we're going to talk about exercise and enrichment and why it is important. The challenge, of course, is how we address that in a shelter. But it is really important to help dogs learn, or to get them to the point where they feel satisfied and satiated, because it's physically draining, and with enrichment, mentally draining. and it helps them be less anxious. Yeah. So benefits of exercise. I mean, we all know this. What's the first thing the doctor says to somebody if they're feeling depressed or anxious? Get out there, get some fresh air, get some exercise. It's really good. Obviously, it helps them control weight, helps combat disease. Great way to connect with the dog. But more importantly, improves mood and self-esteem, promotes better sleep for the dog. I don't know how many of you know this, but dogs can require, and it depends on the breed and the particular dog, but can require up to 17 hours sleep a day. That's a lot. That's hard to achieve in a shelter environment because there's lots of movement backwards and forwards, there's lots of noise, and it can be quite a stressful environment. So if they're not getting enough sleep, that can really impact their stress levels. Obviously, as I mentioned, it decreases depression, anxiety, and stress, improves cognitive function, and releases those feel-good hormones. So regular exercise can help with depression and anxiety, releases the feel-good endorphins, which work on the endogenous cannabinoids, endogenous, which is, you know, what CBD does as well, CBD oil. So it's good for you. But how do we do this in a shelter environment? Now, everybody watching this, all your situations are going to be different. So it's hard for me to address this, but any little bit we can do is important. When I was volunteering at the AWL, the dogs were taken out of their enclosures to run around in a grassed area. The problem being was the amount of time was very short because, you know, you might get 15 minutes, but there's somebody on your heels saying, well, I've got a dog that needs, you know, oh, we need that area as well. So no matter, unfortunately, because there's, you know, these shelters are so full, it's really hard to give the dog what they need in terms of exercise. I know they do have take the dog out day sort of thing where people, you know, they go off to the beach or the park or what have you. But it's hard. I mean, it's not every day of the week. It's really, really hard to meet the exercise needs of a shelter dog. So, but something, you know, it's good to keep that in your mind all the time. Like, are we doing enough for the dog? A dog like this dog probably doesn't need too much exercise, but, you know, there's some dogs that need more and some need less. And one thing to note too is, so, you know, with a shelter dog, they're locked up, I don't know how long a day, depends again on the rescue, but some dogs can find, you know, they'll get out of that, they'll get to have a run around on the grassy area, and it can be almost overstimulating for them. They're going crazy because they've finally got a way to release that energy. So it's getting the right balance too, because you want a dog that's not being overstimulated. You just want to find that balance for that particular dog, the dog in front of you, to make sure that they're getting enough, but not to the point where they're off their head. We want them to be able to come back and relax when they go back into the kennel environment. So enrichment's really important too. In fact, I put it up above exercise. Exercise is important, as I said, but it has to be the right type of exercise where the dog's not getting overstimulated. Whereas enrichment is problem-solving stuff. So where a dog is mentally challenged, and I know you can give them a Kong and stuff, but that's more a diversion to me. I don't think the dog is actually getting the sort of the brain challenge that it needs to help it. It does reduce stress. I mean, I see it with my own dogs. I've got 3 working dogs. They can be quite nutty at times, and you have to give them things where they use their brain, and that usually means using their nose to help bring them down a notch. So there's times when I can't get them out because I'm sick or what have you, and I can see their behavior gets more and more stressed out, and then I have to do something like play find it or something like that, which is easy for me because I'm here at home and I can do it around the house, different in a shelter environment. But there are ways to do it. These are some of the ways. Of course, again, it's hard, but I think in a shelter environment, perhaps you could look at safari type activities. So the dog gets to smell, use its nose, find things along the path. I know it's hard. Puzzle toys, again, yeah, puzzle toys are great. But once the dog solves it, we have to say, well, is it hard enough for the dog? So with any kind of enrichment, you want it to have a slight little bit of frustration, but not too much. So we don't want the dog to give up because it's too hard. We want them to feel that they've solved that puzzle, so to speak. And then we start making it more and more challenging for the dog. But if it's too hard right from the get-go, some dogs will just give up, and so you're not achieving anything. Yeah, so how do you do it in a shelter environment? Again, all your circumstances will be different. But as I said, for me, the mental challenge is much more likely to tire a dog out than exercise, especially I think in a shelter environment, because, you know, it must be almost impossible to give them what they need when they get out into their, play area, if you like. It's tough. So how do we actually think of ways to mentally challenge them? And I've talked about fear of missing out and frustration. So these dogs in particular, like that, the bitch I had at the beginning of the photo of the dog I had, she literally dug holes in our plasterboard. We'd come home and there'd be great big holes in the plasterboard. We had 2 dogs. We knew it was her because she had powder on her legs and her nose. But I wasn't meeting her needs. I wasn't giving her enough exercise. And I was a very green novice dog owner back then. I wasn't a trainer, didn't know anything about separation anxiety or separation related behaviours. She was a 7-month-old teenager, and we talked about teenagers. And she wasn't getting her needs met. So once I started doing that, I gave her the exercise, I gave her the enrichment, she was a different dog. So for the young teenage dog that's acting out, exercise and enrichment play a big role. And calm time is important too. I know you guys are working with dogs in shelters, but I think you're probably, it's important to talk about what happens when the dog goes to its new home, especially because we don't want that dog to end up back in the rescue shelter simply because it's acted out when it's been left alone. Because when it goes to the new home, maybe the guardians don't understand that it's not ready to be left by itself. They go out for a few hours, come back and the house is destroyed. They're probably not going to want the dog. There's every likelihood that dog's going to end up back in the shelter. So when we get a new dog and we get it into its new home, it's really important to try not to force independence and not leave the dog alone until it's ready. And we're going to be talking about thresholds in a little while. But basically, if the dog's not ready to be left by itself, every chance is going to act out. So we need to build that up. So starting very, very small and then building the time that the dog is by itself. I don't like forcing independence, as in you're going over there, you're going to stay over there. Maybe I'm going to chuck you. Maybe I'm going to put you in a crate. And that's where you stay, because the thing with that is if the dog is panicking, we see the owners come home, the dog's out of the crate, covered in blood, lost a few teeth, cut face, etc. So for me, that's not helping the dog. It's not teaching the dog that being by itself is safe. And I'll talk about safe absences. That's what we want to achieve. So we're going to use gradual exposure therapy to safe absences. So it's really important, but also understanding how they communicate what they're trying to tell us. And I don't mean vocally, I'm talking with their body, which is all those signs I talked about previously. And managing absences. So initially when a dog goes into its new home, we don't want to leave it by itself, because there's every chance, unless it's a really robust dog, there's every chance it's going to panic. We don't, especially if we don't know what the history is of the dog, if it's had separation related behaviors before, if we bring the dog into the new home and then 5 hours later we go out to dinner for another 3 hours or whatever, there's every chance that dog's going to panic. So we try to find ways to not leave it by itself while we undergo training. So that means finding somebody to look after the dog. Could be friends and family, could be a pet sitter, or doggy daycare if it's suitable for doggy daycare. Just could be in the neighbours, getting creative about ways of keeping the dog safe, feeling safe, having somebody to look after it, and then building up that home alone time. So we start with the basics, which is basically door desensitization. So whatever the exit point is for that dog in the house, we get the dog not having any value in that exit point. So yes, this is the door I leave by, but it doesn't mean anything to you. There's no value in it. So we desensitize the dog to the door. And then we just build up the short absences into longer absences. And if we do have to go out and leave the dog for longer than it can cope with, we manage the absences. And we don't push the dog too hard into the deep end. Because if you have a rescue dog coming into your home, let's say you're trying to teach, I love this analogy. So you try to teach a toddler to swim. You're not going to take it up to the deep end of the pool and shove it in the water and expect it to swim. It's not going to happen. The toddler, I was going to say the dog then, the toddler is going to panic. It's probably going to end up hating water. It probably won't ever want to go near a pool ever again, and it certainly isn't going to learn to swim. It's going to panic. So if we draw that analogy to leaving a dog home alone for longer than it can cope with, we're basically pushing it into the deep end. So if with that toddler, the better way to do it would be taking them into the shallow end, getting in with them, making them feel confident with that. Only maybe spending a short time in there, getting them out. Okay, now let's go back in. If wait till you're ready, and then we'll go back in and we'll build your confidence so you feel good about it, as opposed to just throwing them in the deep end. So with a new dog coming into the home, rather than doing the pushing into the deep end, we don't leave them for too long. We leave them for a very, very short amount of time. We know we have to understand what the dog's threshold is. So what is the panic line for that dog? At what point are we going to see behaviours, unwanted behaviours? And then we can work under that panic line. So it's gradual exposure to safe absences. So that's why we need to understand what the threshold for that dog is. And that's going to vary for every dog. I've had clients start on 5 minutes, some of them are 5 seconds, and some the person can't even step outside the door. So you guys, I'm sure you've heard of, reactivity in dogs. So a threshold for, say I've got one dog here, the dog here is reactive. And there's going to be a point in time where it sees the other dog, it can see it. So maybe here it's fine, but here it can't cope and it has a meltdown and it's barking, carrying on, etc. So with separation anxiety training, I usually go like this. So that's the threshold. So all the behaviors under here, nice, calm and relaxed, maybe coming up to here, we get that just holding it together behaviors. And then over the line, over the panic line, we see the full-blown meltdowns and the stress behaviors, which we don't want. So the training is done under here, under the threshold, where we're having a safe, where the dog's comfortable. Because if it's not comfortable, we're undermining our training. So we need to understand why they are important. And this applies to, leaving a dog in a shelter, in a kennel in the shelter as well. So the threshold is the point the dog starts panicking. It's going to look different for every dog. So some dogs have some behaviors, some dogs have other behaviors. So we need to know what that particular dog does, what it looks like for that dog, or if they panic before that person leaves them alone. And that is because dogs are watching us all the time. They understand the routines, they understand what comes next. And so some dogs will panic before they are left. And if we know what the threshold is, we can work to keep them under the threshold, working in the safe zone. And that actually, while it seems counterintuitive, it means the progression in the training in the home alone time actually goes a lot quicker than if they're being forced to go over the threshold into panic constantly. So this is another little analogy, the dentist. So you're sitting in a waiting room at the dentist and you're already feeling yucky about it. So if we draw that analogy here, then you're not in the comfortable safe zone, you're probably nudging up here. you're feeling uncomfortable about things, you're just holding it together. You don't want to go into the dentist. And then you go into the dentist and it's absolutely horrid, it's painful, it's scary, it's yucky, yucky, yucky. And then he says, guess what? I want you to come back next week. What do you think you're going to be feeling like the next time you're sitting in that dentist waiting room? You're going to be feeling even worse. And that is why when we talk about keeping the dog under threshold, if they're over threshold, we see escalation of behavior. So people often say, let the dog bark it out. It's just a dog. They'll be fine. They'll get over it. Every single one of my clients comes to me and said, oh yeah, we tried that method. Somebody told us that's what we should be doing. And every time they have tried it, they have seen escalation of behavior. It's got worse and it starts sooner. So if we can keep the dog in the safe zone without being over threshold, where they're feeling confident about being home alone, we actually get quicker. We progress the training, the home alone time further a lot quicker than if they're going over threshold all the time. And here's another little analogy. So I'm terrified of cockroaches, terrified of them. It's really, really aversive for me to look at this photo. I want to flick over to the next slide, but I'm not going to. So what we generally find, and it really depends on the dog, but in general, we find that dogs that have got less room to move, so it could be a crate, could be a kennel, do struggle more with home alone time. So if we can give them more room, they often do a lot better with their home alone time. However, of course, in a shelter environment, we don't have that option. They're stuck in that, whatever it is, whatever area they're in. Now for me, and then maybe being by themselves is also aversive for them in terms of they can't cope. They don't want to be by themselves. So they're really struggling. They've got isolation distress or containment phobia. So it's like claustrophobia. So that's the other thing. So while I'm terrified of cockroaches, I'm also terrified of, I've got claustrophobia as well. I don't know what's going on, sorry. So being contained in a small area for me is really, really horrible. Now, if you feel that full of cockroaches, come on guys, hey, shush. If you feel that full of cockroaches, that is going to make, it's a double whammy for me. So having a dog in a small enclosed area, if they've got containment phobia, that's really hard for them. It makes them really struggle. And then they're also by themselves. So it can be really hard. You've got this kind of double whammy of things for the dog to try to cope with, which makes sense that they might go over threshold quite quickly. So what is the impact of fear? So it's an emotional response, as we know, because it's something scary for the dog. And you look at this photo, I mean, that dog does actually look very uncomfortable. You see the whale eye there. Its pupils are quite big. It's kind of worried. It looks worried. This photo is a moment in time though, so we don't really know what's going on. Could be that someone's waving a treat and it's got that doggy, oh, give me the treat. Just a thing on whale eye too, with the whites of the eye. So we also have to be careful because dogs like pugs, for example, have got lots of white showing. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're scared or worried. It's just them. So that's where the whole context thing comes in play. So some fear responses, fight. So you might see a dog that is, I don't know, if it's in an environment with another dog, obviously you don't do that. You're making sure that dogs get on if they're in with another dog, but maybe you'll see it explode one of its toys or its bedding or something because it's almost fighting with, it's trying to get that out. Flight, so trying to escape. Freezing, the statue, fidgeting, pacing, fawning, and fretting. So there's some of the things that we see. And as I've mentioned, so what happens? Panic starts earlier. We see escalation of behavior and things can get worse and not better. Obviously, when a dog is scared, its thinking brain is gone. There's nobody home. And I see this with my dog. So he's noise phobic. If there's a storm I would be very, very cautious about letting him outside in the backyard by himself, because he'd probably go over the fence and up the road and disappear. He would be that panicked, and it wouldn't matter what I did if I was trying to call him. He's reacting. He's not thinking. There's literally nobody home. So fear is very, very detrimental, and they're not learning anything. They can't possibly learn. They're too scared. So from door desensitization, we can move on to daily structured plan. So basically with the door desensitization, we have whatever the exit point is. And we're just like, it doesn't matter. There's no value in this exit point. Just get, people come and go. Doesn't necessarily involve you. And then we start working on a target time, whatever, not understanding what the threshold is, and then working under that threshold. And as I said, we don't, that's going to depend on every dog. So understanding what the threshold is, understanding that the dog some dogs get anxious before they're even left alone. And then employing desensitization and gradual exposure and building up that time. So here's the threshold. We start well underneath the threshold time, and then we gradually build up that time for the dog. Unfortunately, there aren't any quick fixes for separation anxiety. We've talked about this. So dog that becomes anxious before the guardian leaves or before they are left alone, we can start with some sort of door desensitization or some sort of desensitization to being left by themselves. So I use what I call the alone method. So basically we need to know what the threshold is so we can keep under the threshold. If we don't know what the threshold is, we're in danger of going over the threshold, and that's going to be detrimental to the dog. We're trying to learn, we're helping the dog learn to be calm when they're left alone. We're observing the dog so it never goes over threshold. And that means A, understanding body language, and B, maybe watching them on some sort of camera feed to stop them going over threshold. Nurturing home alone time so they understand about being calm, being confident, being comfortable, and then consistency is really important, because one training session by itself doesn't cut it. You need to it needs to be consistent, building up that time, building solid foundations, doing it slowly so that we get there quicker. I call it rushing slowly. And as I said, I call it the 4 C's: confident, comfortable, calm, and consistent, using easy step-by-step guidance. So we're keeping the dog under threshold. We're using gradual exposure therapy to safe absences. We understand what they're trying to tell us with their body language. And then, if possible, trying to find them company while they're undergoing training. So things to look at: vet check to rule out pain, rule out any medical issues, rule out, cognitive decline, etc., etc. Determining what the threshold is. If there's pre-departure cues that trigger the dog, so that means leaving cues. Like I said, dogs are watching us all the time. They want to know if something affects them and how that might affect them. So pre-departure cues could be keys. It could be certain things that we do. For a dog in a kennel, perhaps it's clipping up a lead or something because the lead maybe stays outside the kennel. That would be probably quite a big trigger for a dog. Desensitization, training starts below the threshold, gradual exposure to safe absences, some sort of pre-steps. So if you have a 1 minute absence, then you might do a series of pre-steps where we're just doing some sort of desensitization work to lead up to the last step, the target time. And that will depend on the dog in front of you. And then increasing the time slowly. That's so important. And that's where a lot of people come unstuck, because they try to increase the time too quickly. Exercise that's not overstimulating, but still satisfying. Enrichment, so important. We want the dog to be ready to rest and relax. And I would never do any type of training when the dog is hungry, if it hasn't been toileted, if it's expecting something like a play, walk, event. initially choosing a time that the dog is most likely to do well, and that is when it's ready to rest and relax. Starting with the easiest scenario for the dog, and then making it harder as we go along, but not initially. Solid foundations are so important. Things that can impact a dog, so time of day, the day of the week, time of day, especially for a shelter dog, I think. And also, you know, dogs can trigger stack. So if you don't understand what that means, it means like maybe one little thing goes wrong or they have a bad experience, but it's not huge. But then there might be a series of little things and their bucket gets really full and they can't cope. So we call it trigger stacking. Some dogs, you know, if it's stormy, if it's windy, it might be more difficult for them. A shelter environment, very difficult because you've got dogs walking by, their neighbours' dogs maybe barking, etc., etc. People walking by, workmen in the area, not enough sleep. As I said, dogs need sleep, and shelter environments, you know, they're so noisy. There's a lot going on. They can get overstimulated, or they're just simply not getting enough sleep. And every dog is different, so we can't take a blanket approach. Some dogs do need medication if they've got, for example, generalized anxiety. So a dog that's afraid of the world is certainly a conversation to have with a vet. Now, I'm not a vet, and there are no magic pills either. So training still needs to be done. Any kind of medication facilitates the training. It's not a magic pill. Most medications build up in the system and they can take 6 to 8 weeks to work. So unfortunately, even less of a magic pill, but yeah. So we can use prescribed medication. We can use natural remedies. Things like full spectrum CBD. So CBD is good. Again, none of these are magic pills. They all go hand in hand with training. Calming supplements, they all vary. It depends on the manufacturer. It depends on the, you know, where you're getting the product, how good it is. Essential oils, same. So, you know, I don't know what sort of shelters you guys are involved with, but, you know, often there might be pheromones, you know, vet recommended pheromones. Again, they can help. All this stuff can help, but then training still needs to be done. Music is very good. I think the caveat for me with music is that some music is too much. So where I was volunteering, they played classical. There was a section where they played classical music for the dogs. These were the dogs that were struggling a bit more with you know, being there. Unfortunately, it was just a radio station, and the music was sometimes it was just awful. I mean, it was classical, which was good, but it was like this really screechy opera, or just the wrong kind of classical music, you know, some hard jazz, which was just too much and certainly not relaxing for me to listen to. So I can't imagine what it was like for the dogs. So music, yeah, it can also help mask external noises, which might undermine the dog's ability to be home alone, to be by itself. However, yeah, just getting the right type of music, something calming, diet and nutrition and medical impacts. So all these things we need to look at. We need to look at the big picture and say, what can we use that might help the situation? Just look, if dogs are exhibiting these behaviours, separation related behaviours, they are in general in a state of fear and panic. So we do need to be patient and we do need to be understanding, because they can't help it. And also, you know, sometimes they'll have good days and sometimes they'll have bad days, and that is just how it goes. So just keep that in mind. So any questions? That's my details there if anybody wants to reach out.
That's wonderful, Ness. Thank you so much. We are actually over the hour.
Oh, are we?
But yeah,
Sorry.
no, that's fine.
I'm sorry
But
about my dog's barking as well. It's just yes, very naughty.
we couldn't actually hear it, so
Oh,
don't
could you
worry
not?
too much.
Phew.
But just wondering if anyone's got any quick questions before we let Ness go. I know everyone's so busy, and trying to squeeze everything in a day is difficult. So we won't keep you much longer, but I just wanted to make sure, just check if there were any quick questions for Ness. I think a big takeaway for me is that, you know, what we see in a shelter environment is not necessarily what we're going to see in a home. So I think that's a really good one for us to remember. And, you know, particularly if the dogs aren't coming in with a history, we know that past behaviour is the best indicator of future behaviour. But what we're seeing in an unnatural environment like a shelter, you know, I think often we get a little bit too concerned about it. So yeah, thank you for making that point. And also that, you know, I think what I've really taken away today is that if we do see separation related behaviours, it's not necessarily the end of the world. And so many of them can be worked through, and they're not all, you know, separation anxiety, this, you know, this dog's going to be a nightmare for the rest of its life. There's that gradient, isn't there? And often that settling in time can be the worst. So yeah, they're really good points to make, and I appreciate that, Ness. So thank you.
Yeah, actually,
All right.
do you mind if I just quickly touch on that? So there's what they
Course.
call the 3-3-3 rule, which is when a dog goes into its new home, you know, three days to sort of get its bearings, 3 weeks to start getting used to the routine, and 3 months to finally feel at home. So that time, I mean, is, you know, you are going to see the dog change, but also you can't get to the end of 3 months and say, well, it's been 3 months, it should be fine by now, because every dog is different and they go through, you know, different emotional responses to things. So
Of course. And I think 3 months is actually quite a short period of time. I'd love to know what that was actually based on, because for me it's more like 12 months.
Yeah.
You know, that the dogs that have been through tumultuous times often won't settle in fully, and you'll see big changes in their behaviours, you know, at around that 12 months, and then they're feeling a bit better about where they are. So yeah, it can take time, and I think our role in the sector is really to support. So support the new adopters or the foster carers, and to support those dogs, and make sure that that support is really easy to access, and that we're doing our adoption follow-ups. And, you know, volunteers can do that. So it doesn't necessarily need to be another thing for staff to do. But that, you know, that is the biggest role that we play there, is that we are there to support, to make sure we're not getting those bounce backs, those returns for this reason, because that's not going to improve the situation. So, you know, putting the new adopters or the foster carers in touch with, if we've got, you know, behaviour staff internally or externally, it's going to be a much better option in the long run to help them work through those issues. So we appreciate that your time today. Thank you, Ness. And Amber, yes, the recording will be available in the next day or two. I'll have that up on the website. And so, you know, these recordings of the webinars make great staff and volunteer training sessions. They're always available for everyone to access at any time. So thank you so much, Ness. We really appreciate your expertise and your time today. It's a tricky topic, but everyone's got your contact details there if they've got any more questions. And stay tuned, everybody, for news about the next webinar that we'll have up and coming in the next couple of months. So keep an eye on our e-news and on our social media pages, and yeah, stay in touch. So thank you so much, Ness. We'll let everyone go now, and appreciate your time today. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.